All right, today we're going to break down a theory that claims the recent attack in Washington, D.C. was not at all what it seemed. The source material for this explainer argues that what we've been told is, well, a lie, a deliberate cover-up for something far more calculated. Let's dive in.
So you've probably heard the official story, right? On November 26th, Ramanola Lockenwall, a refugee who just slipped through the cracks, acted alone, a lone wolf who snapped under pressure and attacked National Guard troops. The narrative is a tragic but simple vetting failure. But the source material we're looking at today says, nope, not even close. It argues this is a carefully constructed lie.
And this is really the heart of it all. The claim isn't just that the story is wrong. It's that the attack itself wasn't random at all. It was, as they put it, a function. Like a piece being moved on a chessboard right when it needed to be, for a very specific reason. So where do we start? The first big piece of this theory is the timing. And according to the source, it's just statistically impossible for it to be a coincidence. To really get it, we can't start on the day of the attack. No, we've got to go back 5 days.
And this really sets up the central question, doesn't it? Was this attack just unbelievably bad luck, a terrible coincidence? Or was it something else? A direct, calculated answer to a huge political and legal mess the administration was in.
Okay, so the source lays out this really tight 5-day timeline. Let's walk through it. On Friday, November 21st, the administration gets hit with this massive legal blow. A judge rules their troop deployment in D.C. is illegal. On that very same day, a secret DHS memo reportedly orders a review of Afghan refugees. By Sunday, you've got lawmakers telling troops to refuse unlawful orders, and then, boom, Wednesday, Lockenwall attacks the exact guard unit at the heart of that judge's ruling. Just like that, the story flips. They go from being called illegal occupiers to heroes under fire overnight.
So, what does all that timing mean? Well, this brings us right back to that first pillar of the theory. The source basically says, do the math. The odds of some random refugee, on his own, just happening to attack the exact unit needed to completely flip the script on a disastrous court ruling just 120 hours after it happened, they claim the probability is less than 1%. It's not just unlikely, they call it a statistical impossibility. Okay, so if the timing is that suspicious, what about the man himself? Who was this guy? The next part of this theory really starts to pick apart that whole lone wolf story, and it paints a picture of someone far more deliberate, and frankly, a lot more dangerous.
Now, before we dig into Lockenwall's background, we have to understand this term, zero unit. What is that? Well, these guys weren't your regular soldiers. According to a lot of open-source reporting, these were CIA-run paramilitary squads back in Afghanistan. Their whole deal was targeted missions, and they were trained for one thing above all else: absolute loyalty to their American handlers. And here's where it gets really specific. The source alleges that Ramanola Lockenwall wasn't just some civilian. They claim he was a member of one of the most infamous zero units out there, the Kandahar Strike Force. Now, think about what that means. It completely reframes who he is. He's not some panicked father or radicalized guy. He's a professional operative with a very, very specific set of skills. And the source really drives this point home with this powerful line. Think about it. If he really was a KSF member, then the U.S. didn't just bring over a refugee family seeking safety. They brought over a highly trained, dormant weapon, an asset. And for 3 years, this guy was just living quietly in Washington state. So the big question is, why was he activated now? And that question, why now, that brings us to what the source calls the absolute centerpiece of their theory, the smoking gun. They argue that everyone's focus on Lockenwall arriving back in 2021, that's a distraction. That's not the real story. The real key, they claim, isn't when he got here. I mean, that happened under a whole different administration. The truly critical piece of the puzzle, the thing that they say ties him directly to the current administration, is the date his asylum was officially approved. And there's the date, April 23rd, 2025. This, according to the source, is the day the current administration officially granted Ramanola Lockenwall asylum. That single act turned him from a temporary visitor into a permanent resident, with a clear path to citizenship for his entire family. So you're probably asking, how could that happen? Well, the source points to a very specific legal process. There's this law that basically put asylum cases on a 150-day conveyor belt. Lockenwall applied, the clock started ticking, and 150 days later, boom, automatic approval. But, and this is a huge but, the DHS secretary had what the source calls a kill switch, the power to pause that clock for exceptional circumstances. Like needing to do a super deep background check on a guy who was maybe, just maybe, part of a CIA paramilitary unit. But the source claims that switch was never flipped. The clock just ran out, and the approval went right on through.
All right, so we've talked about the timing, and we've talked about who this guy might really be. The next piece of this puzzle is something we can all understand. Follow the money. How on earth does an Amazon Flex driver, who's supposedly living paycheck to paycheck, suddenly come up with the cash for a complex cross-country operation? The source estimates that this operation would have cost, at a bare minimum, about $3,000. You gotta figure that's for a 2,800-mile trip, hotels, gas, a weapon. So the question is simple. Where did a guy with a wife and 5 kids to support suddenly get that kind of untraceable cash? So this leaves us with 2 totally different pictures of this guy, right? On one side, you have the panicked father, a guy who just hit the jackpot, he won asylum for his family, their future is secure. Why would he throw all of that away in a suicidal attack? It makes no sense. But on the other side, you have the obedient asset. Suddenly, he has thousands in cash, and he's willing to sacrifice everything, including his family's future, for the mission. The source basically asks which one of these 2 people actually fits the evidence. Okay, let's step back and put all these pieces on the table. When you look at the timing, the shooter's alleged background, how his asylum got approved, and where the money came from, the source argues that the whole lone wolf story just completely falls apart. And in its place, something far more structured, far more deliberate seems to appear. So, to recap, these are the 4 pillars of what they call the April surprise theory. 1. The timing, an attack that just so happens to be the perfect antidote to a devastating court ruling. 2. The shooter, not a random refugee, but a trained paramilitary operative. 3. The asylum. It was approved by the current administration, which, they claim, had every power to stop it. And 4. The money, an untraceable source of cash for a pretty complex mission. And this final quote from the source really sums up what they believe the endgame was. In this telling, the attack gave the administration the perfect excuse, the political cover it needed, to just ignore a court order and ramp up its military presence. And for the public, we got a nice, simple explanation. A lone wolf, a scapegoat. And that's where this theory leaves us. It doesn't give us a final, definitive answer. Instead, it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought. It's laid out this incredibly detailed alternative story and basically asks us to look again at what we've been told. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, this one event wasn't the end of the story, but just one piece of a much, much bigger puzzle.